Welcome to the Catholic Reason, my friends, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and sometimes culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio 94.9 and 102.9, but you may be listening on your own local Catholic radio station at a different time since the Catholic Reason is now aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. So if you're listening outside the Tulsa area, a very special welcome to you, and thanks for joining me today. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast, and you can also access the archived episodes at my website, karlobroussard.com, under both the audio and video tab. Now, when it comes to belief that Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist, Christians often appeal to Jesus' words at the Last Supper, where he says, "This is my body, this is my blood," as evidence for the belief. But, as we've discussed in a previous episode of the Catholic Reason, entitled, "Are Catholics Wrong About the Last Supper?" many Protestants offer counterlines of exegesis of these words that lead them to believe that Jesus intended the words to be taken metaphorically rather than literally. In today's episode, I'd like to look at a couple more Protestant responses to the literal reading. Responses that I actually deal with in my book, Meeting the Protestant Response, How to Answer Common Comebacks to Catholic Arguments, that you can get at shop.catholic.com. The first Protestant response, or comeback, comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. Protestant apologist James White made this argument in his early 90s debate on the Mass with Father Mitch Pacwa. And here's how he made the argument. He said this: Christ was the rock. Was Christ literally a rock? He's referring to 1 Corinthians 10:4 here. He goes on. It's the exact same Greek term, eimi. Estin is used by Jesus in Matthew. Eimi is used there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Christ was the rock. Does that mean he was literally rock? I would submit to you that no, it does not mean that at all. So that's how White puts the argument. The basic idea is this: if we take the bread and wine to be really Jesus' body and blood because he says, "This is my body, this is my blood," well, then we're going to have to say Paul meant the rock that followed the Israelites in the wilderness to be really Jesus, since he says in 1 Corinthians 10:4, the rock was Christ. As White points out, the same Greek word is used there for the verb to be, is. But most Christians don't believe that the rock really was Jesus, as believers in the real presence believe that the consecrated host really is Jesus' body. Therefore, so the conclusion is, we shouldn't take Jesus to mean that the bread and wine really became Jesus' body and blood because he says, "This is my body, this is my blood." So let's see how we might respond to this objection from, again, 1 Corinthians 10:4, where it talks about how the rock was Christ. Well, first, the appeal to 1 Corinthians 10:4 doesn't show that Jesus' use of "is" must be taken figuratively. It shows only that the verb to be, is, can be taken figuratively. So this argument gets only as far as saying a figurative interpretation, like in 1 Corinthians 10:4, is possible. But this is a moot point because a believer in the real presence could agree that Jesus' words, "This is my body, this is my blood," taken by themselves can be interpreted literally or figuratively. There's nothing in the words themselves that determines one interpretation over the other. So believers in the real presence need not have any qualms about saying that these words could be taken figuratively when they're considered in isolation from other evidence. So the appeal to 1 Corinthians 10:4 is simply supporting what we already think and believe, namely that the words taken by themselves could be taken figuratively. And so, of course, this leads us to our second response. The objection demands that a Catholic interpret Jesus' use of the verb to be at the Last Supper in the same way it's being used in 1 Corinthians 10:4. That is to say, figuratively. The reason being that it's supposedly obvious that bread and wine can't be Jesus' body and blood, just like it's obvious or the rock can't be Christ. However, such a demand that the verb to be taken in the same way in both biblical passages, such a demand makes sense only on the supposition that Jesus is not performing a miracle. We would be inclined to interpret Jesus' words, "This is my body," figuratively or metaphorically, only on supposition that there's no miraculous environment in which Jesus is saying these words. Because taken by themselves, you would think, yeah, he's just speaking figuratively. But when you consider other evidence, the literal interpretation becomes the more plausible interpretation. So, for example, I might hold up a picture of my father and say, "This is my father." And you know that picture is not literally my father, but just simply a figure or representation of him, right? But, and here's the key, your conclusion that I'm speaking figuratively and that it's just a representation of my father would be based on the assumption, and a true one at that I'm not performing the miracle of making my father substantially present under the form of ink and paper or pixels on a phone, depending upon the nature of the picture. Similarly, to interpret Jesus' use of "is" at the Last Supper figuratively would be natural if we already knew he's not performing a miracle. But if there's evidence that what Jesus is doing at the Last Supper is miraculous, well then a literal interpretation becomes a viable option. And even so, I would argue, a more probable one. And there is an abundance of such evidence. Now, due to limited time here, we're going to consider only some of it. So consider the backdrop of the ode manna, which Jesus intentionally sets up to be a backdrop against which he's giving us the Eucharist. When Jesus first makes the promise to give us his flesh to eat, in John chapter 6, verses 49 through 50, he does so against the backdrop of the manna of old. He says, "Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that man may eat of it and not die. The bread which I shall give," notice the future tense there, indicating of what he will give us, which is ultimately fulfilled at the Last Supper. "The bread which I shall give for the life of the world," Jesus says, "is my flesh." This bread that God gave in the wilderness was not ordinary bread. It was miraculous bread. That's the backdrop. So, for example, it appeared every day when the morning dew would burn off, according to Exodus 16:13. It never lasted more than a day, except on the Sabbath. When the Israelites didn't obey the instruction to leave none until the next day, it, as Exodus 16:19 through 20 says, bred worms and became foul. But when the Israelites held it over in accordance with the Lord's command, that is, to assure that they did not have to work on the Sabbath, it didn't breed worms and become foul, according to verses 22 through 26 of Exodus 16. It appeared every day for 40 years, and then all of a sudden stopped upon the Israelites entering the Promised Land, according to Exodus 16:35 and Joshua 5:10 through 12. And then finally, a jar of an omer's worth of the manna was kept in the Israelite sanctuary, quote unquote, throughout the generations, we're told in Exodus 16:31 through 34. Those are all miraculous elements concerning the old manna. So, as Bible scholar Dr. Brant Petrie argues in his book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, to say the Eucharist at the Last Supper, the new manna, is merely a symbol, we'd have to conclude that the old manna in the wilderness was superior to the new, since miraculous bread is clearly greater than ordinary bread. But that's a no-go in biblical theology. The New Testament fulfillment is always greater than the Old Testament type. So by providing us the Ode manna, the miraculous bread of Ode, as a backdrop for the Eucharist, this allows for us to infer that the Eucharist, being the new manna, must be miraculous in some sense as well, indicating that it cannot be merely a symbol. And so the Ode manna and the miraculous context of the Eucharist as the new manna provides for us a reason to interpret Jesus's words, "This is my body, this is my blood," as literally, because that would indeed be a miracle of some sort, even though you don't have the visible aspect of a bona fide miracle. This is miraculous in some sense, insofar as Jesus would be changing bread and wine into his body and his blood. And that would constitute the Eucharist as the new manna. That would give it a miraculous quality, thereby at least making it equal to the Ode manna. But the superiority of the new manna would be insofar as it's the body and blood of Jesus Christ and not just miraculous bread. And so the Ode manna creates the Ode manna as a backdrop for the Eucharist creates a supernatural, miraculous context, which allows for us to interpret the words, "This is my body," as in a literal way, as opposed to a metaphorical way. So that's our first response here, or first evidence of the miraculous context, but more to come on the other side. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. In today's episode, we're looking at some Protestant responses or comebacks to the literal reading of our Lord's words of institution at the Last Supper, "This is my body, this is my blood." And one Protestant comeback that we're looking at in the first segment comes from 1 Corinthians 10:4, where Paul says the rock that followed the Israelites in the wilderness was Christ. So if we're going to interpret Jesus' words at the Last Supper, "This is my body," literally, well, then we would have to interpret Paul's words that the rock literally is Jesus. But of course, we don't interpret Paul's words that the rock was Christ literally, and so therefore we shouldn't be interpreting the words of institution literally. Just because is used, so the argument goes, doesn't necessarily follow that Jesus is literally changing bread and wine into his body and his blood. Now, in response, I said in the first segment that, first of all, the appeal to 1 Corinthians 10:4 simply proves that the verb to be could be used figuratively. And we agree with that. When you look at the words, "This is my body, this is my blood," in and of themselves, it could be literal or it could be figuratively. We understand that. But the figurative interpretation would succeed if and only if there is no supernatural, miraculous context in which Jesus says this. But if there is a miraculous, supernatural context, then the literal interpretation becomes more likely and more probable. So the question becomes, is there any evidence of a miraculous supernatural context in which Jesus says these words, "This is my body, this is my blood"? And I argued so far the answer is yes. And the first supporting evidence would be the backdrop that Jesus creates concerning the Ode manna. Jesus does this explicitly in John 6 when he promises to give us the bread from heaven, which is his flesh, the Eucharist. He draws a parallel between the Eucharist and the Ode manna, which was miraculous. So by Jesus creating the backdrop of the Eucharist to be the Ode manna, which was miraculous, that creates a supernatural, miraculous context in which he gives us the Eucharist and saying, "This is my body, this is my blood." So if the Eucharist is the new manna, then it would be miraculous. And the miraculous nature of the Eucharist would lend credence to a literal interpretation of Jesus saying, "This is my body, this is my blood," since to change bread and wine into his body and blood would indeed be miraculous. And that would be befitting of the Eucharist as the new manna. Now, there's another line of supporting evidence for the miraculous nature or context in which Jesus gives us the Eucharist and says these words, "This is my body, this is my blood," and that is the need for faith in the Eucharist. That the Eucharist is supernatural is further confirmed by Jesus' teaching that faith is required to accept his command to eat his flesh and drink his blood, there in John 6. Jesus prefaces his revelation that his flesh is the bread of life by saying this, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." Then, after giving his discourse about eating his flesh and drinking his blood in verses 54 through 58, he says there in 63, "There are some of you that do not believe." Actually, this would be, I think, 65 of John chapter 6. "There are some of you that do not believe. This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it's granted him by my Father." So consider this. If Jesus begins and concludes his remarks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood with faith, a gift that only the Father can give, then Jesus is revealing that faith is required to accept his teaching, to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And so that's the first line of evidence. Jesus sandwiches, right, his teaching of eating his flesh and drinking his blood between the two bookends of no one coming to him except the Father drawing him. So faith is required to accept the teaching. Now, there's something else Jesus says in verse 63 that reveals the requirement of faith. He says this, "It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is of no avail. The words that I've spoken to you are spirit and life," there in verse 63. Now recall, quote unquote, "the flesh" is a New Testament phrase often used to describe human nature apart from God's grace. We see this in Mark 14:38, Romans 8:1 through 14, 1 Corinthians 2:14 through chapter 3, verse 1. So what Jesus means is that without God's grace, and in particular the grace of faith, acceptance of Jesus' command to eat his flesh and drink his blood is impossible. It's not going to happen. If his disciples are to believe his teaching and command to eat his flesh and drink his blood, they must avail themselves of that grace. The grace of faith is going to be required. Jesus' statement about his words being spirit and life means that his teaching to eat his flesh and drink his blood is of the Spirit and therefore can be accepted only by the power of the Spirit. And this makes sense of why Jesus' command to eat his flesh and drink his blood is bookended by his teachings about faith, as we already indicated in verses 44 and 65. Since what Jesus says in John 6 is a promise of what will be fulfilled at the Last Supper, and he teaches that faith is required to accept what he says, well, then it follows that faith would also be required when confronted with the words of Jesus at the Last Supper, "This is my body, this is my blood." So the point here is that in light of what we read in John 6, faith is required to accept Jesus' teaching about the Eucharist, to eat his flesh and drink his blood, which is fulfilled in the command of Jesus when he says, "This is my body, take and eat. This is my body, take and drink. This is my blood." So faith is required to assent to those words. Now, consider this. What need would there be for faith if the bread and wine at the Last Supper were intended by Jesus to merely represent or signify his body and his blood? Faith would not be needed to believe that bread and wine serve as a symbol of Jesus' body and blood, any more than we would need God-given faith to believe that a photograph is a picture of my Father. I'm going to repeat that because that's an important principle right there. Faith would not be needed to believe that bread and wine serve as a symbol of Jesus' body and blood, any more than we would need God-given faith to believe that a photograph is a picture of my Father. Faith isn't required, friends, for one thing to be a symbol of another or to believe that one thing is a symbol of another. But faith would be needed to believe that Jesus changed bread and wine into his body and his blood, which of course would be miraculous without the visible appearances changing as such. Faith would be required to believe that claim. Since Jesus teaches that faith is required to accept what he says about the bread and wine being his body and his blood, but then it follows that there is a supernatural dimension to the Eucharist. And if the Eucharist is supernatural, then we have good reason not to automatically take Jesus' words to be metaphorical. The scales can be tipped in favor of the literal reading. The supernatural nature of the Eucharist makes the literal interpretation now a plausible and even more reasonable option. Remember how we said initially when you take the words in and of themselves within a regular old context, you would reasonably conclude Jesus is using the verb to be to signify or represent in the sense of representation, like the bread and the wine represent Jesus' body and blood. But once we establish the supernatural miraculous context in light of the old manna and the necessity of faith to accept this mystery of the Eucharist, then with that supernatural context, the literal reading becomes the more reasonable reading, because faith would not be required, right, to believe that the bread and wine are mere symbols of Jesus' body and blood, but faith would be required if this is a miraculous thing going on behind the veil of the senses. All right, now, this supernatural character of the Eucharist is actually picked up on by St. Irenaeus in his work Against Heresies, Book 4, Chapter 33, writing about late 180s, so roughly about AD 189. Irenaeus argues that divine power was needed for Jesus to say what he did at the Last Supper. He writes this, quote, "If the Lord were from other than the Father, how could he rightly take bread, which is of the same creation as our own, and confess it to be his body and affirm that the mixture in the cup is his blood?" Notice what Irenaeus is doing there. He appeals to Jesus' divine origins in order to justify what he's saying at the Last Supper. Now, ask yourself this question. Why would Jesus need divine power simply to state that bread and wine were mere symbols of his body and blood? The answer is he would not need divine power to simply state that the bread and wine were mere symbols of his body and his blood. So, insofar as Irenaeus thinks that Jesus needs to have divine power to say what he did, it follows that Irenaeus believed that the Eucharist there at the Last Supper was not merely a symbol of his body and his blood, but rather that the bread and the wine miraculously became Jesus' body and his blood. That would require divine power. Now, a Protestant may object here and say, well, all the above arguments, Karlo, that you've presented so far assume that Jesus' teaching in John 6 is connected to Jesus' words at the Last Supper. You've been making that assumption the whole time, reading the Last Supper in light of John 6, utilizing John 6 as an interpretive context for the words of institution at the Last Supper. But that's an assumption, so the argument would go, that we don't have to accept. And some will go on and say, there are two different Greek words that are being used, sarx for flesh in John 6, and soma for body at the Last Supper. Protestant apologist Eric Svensson makes this argument this way in his book Evangelical Answers on page 182. But I'm going to have to hit the pause button here and come back to this counter argument from Svensson and other apologists on the other side of the break. So, my friends, I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. In today's episode, we're looking at a few Protestant comebacks to the literal interpretation of Jesus' words of institution at the Last Supper. This is my body, this is my blood. One comeback that we've been considering comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, where Paul says the rock that followed the Israelites in the wilderness was Christ. So if we're going to interpret Jesus literally because he uses the verb to be at the Last Supper, then we would have to interpret Paul literally, that the rock literally was Christ, or that the Christ was literally the rock because he uses the verb to be. Now, our response there so far has been, well, when we look at the words of institution by themselves, we agree that you would be inclined to interpret those words metaphorically, since, there would be no obvious reason to think that bread is actually becoming Jesus. But if you have further evidence, like a miraculous or supernatural context that Jesus intentionally creates, in which he pronounces these words of institution, then the literal interpretation becomes the more reasonable interpretation. So is there such evidence of a miraculous supernatural context? The answer is yes. We made the argument from the Ode Manna, which Jesus intentionally makes to be the Old Testament backdrop against which he gives us the Eucharist by saying, this is my body, this is my blood. And then secondly, Jesus is teaching on the need for faith to assent to the mystery of the Eucharist, both in John 6, the promise, and then the Last Supper, the fulfillment. And then finally, before the break, I was appealing to St. Irenaeus, who argues that Jesus would be required to have divine power. He must have divine origin to say what he said at the Last Supper, which entails that Irenaeus did not believe the Eucharist to be merely a symbol, because you don't need divine power to state that bread and wine are symbols of his body and his blood, or body and blood. But Jesus would require divine power if he were changing bread and wine into his body and his blood. And so that suggests Irenaeus did not believe the Eucharist to be a mere symbol, but to be literally the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Now, before the break, we began to look at a counter-argument that some Protestants will pose to us, and that is we're assuming that what Jesus is teaching in John 6 is connected to the words of the Last Supper. But that's an assumption we don't have to accept, and the reason that some give is that the Greek words used, sarx for flesh in John 6 and soma for body at the Last Supper, are different. And I mentioned how Protestant apologist Eric Svensson makes this argument in his book, Evangelical Answers, on page 182. So here's what he writes. The Greek word used in John 6 to designate that which we are to eat is sarx, translated flesh, while the Greek word used in the Last Supper text is always soma, translated body. He goes on, the differences between these words suggest that if a connection between John 6 and the Eucharist is made, it must be a loose one. This fits well with the symbolic understanding of John 6. So the idea here is, since there are two Greek words being used for flesh and body in John 6 and at the Last Supper, we have good reason to undermine the assumed connection between the two. So how do we respond? Well, one problem with this argument is that sarx and soma are used interchangeably in the New Testament. Consider Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16, for example. He writes, "Do you not know that he who joins himself to a prostitute becomes one body with her?" Greek there, soma for body. He goes on, "For as it is written, the two shall become one flesh." Greek there, sarx. Notice that Paul uses sarx for the Bible's talk of union of flesh and identifies it with the one body, soma, that results from a man joining himself to a prostitute. So he's using those two words interchangeably there. Another example is 2 Corinthians 4, 10 through 11. Paul writes this, "Always carrying in the body, soma, somati, the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies, somati. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh," there in Greek, sarki. So death is at work in you, in us, but life in you. If we were to follow the logic of this counter-argument from Svensson, we'd have to conclude that Paul here is saying the life of Jesus is manifested in two different things, since he's using two different words, soma and sarx. But clearly that's not the case. Whether Paul speaks of bodies, somati, or flesh, sarx, he's referring to the same thing, the earthen vessel. That's the idea. Paul's teaching the Corinthians how Christians view their physical sufferings for the faith. Now, other examples where Paul uses sarx and soma interchangeably are Romans 7, 24 through 25 and 8, 13, Ephesians 5, 28 through 30, and Colossians 2, 23. And this makes sense because bodies are made of flesh, right? Insofar as Paul is speaking of the same thing with these two different words, speaking of the body, speaking of the flesh, soma and sarx, that makes sense because, as I said, bodies are made of flesh. So If there is no indication that body is being used in some sense as not to include flesh, well, then we're justified in reading body as entailing flesh. Since Jesus doesn't say anything at the Last Supper to preclude or exclude our understanding of body as flesh, well, then we can reasonably take body to mean flesh, as entailing flesh, and thereby affirm the connection between John 6 and the Last Supper. Now, a second response to this argument that we're assuming John 6 to be connected to the Last Supper is that the image of drinking Jesus' blood is used in both narratives. And both narratives are the only places in the New Testament where Jesus speaks of drinking his blood. Think about this. The fewer times an image or cluster of words is used, especially when it's found prior to its current use, the more likely it is that there is literary dependence. Given that the Last Supper is the only place in the New Testament where Jesus speaks of drinking his blood, other than in John 6, and Jesus' command to drink his blood in John 6 occurs prior in Jesus' ministry to the command given at the Last Supper, well then we're justified in reading the words of institution at the Last Supper to drink his blood in light of what Jesus says in John 6. To say there's no connection between the words of institution at the Last Supper and Jesus' command to eat his flesh and drink his blood in John 6 would be akin to saying John doesn't have the creation story in mind when he writes in John 1:1, in the beginning, right? And so the point here is insofar as the imagery of drinking Jesus' blood is present only in John 6 and the words of institution at the Last Supper, we can utilize John 6 as an interpretive context for the words of institution at the Last Supper. There is indeed a connection. Now, my third response is that in John 6, Jesus doesn't give us any indication that he intends his audience to eat his flesh and drink his blood right then and there. Rather, he speaks as if it's something to be done at some later time, which would fit our interpretation that the Last Supper is that moment. For example, he speaks in the future tense in John 6:51, the bread which I shall give for the life of the world is my flesh. The other times when he gives instructions about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, it's hypothetical and general in nature. So he says, if anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. There in verse 51 of John 6. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, there in verse 53. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, there in verse 56. He who eats me will live because of me, in verse 57 of John 6. He who eats this bread, his flesh, will live forever, there in verse 58. Now, contrast this with the Last Supper, where Jesus says, take, eat, this is my body, there in Matthew 26:26. Jesus promised in John 6 to give the disciples his flesh and blood to eat and drink. But at the Last Supper, he commands it to be done. Given what we've said already about these events being the only two instances where Jesus speaks of drinking his blood, we are totally justified in saying the promise in John 6 is fulfilled at the Last Supper. A fourth response is that biblical scholars recognize that it's John's intent to supplement with his gospel what's found in the synoptics by adding theological depth. So, for example, Mark and Matthew record Jesus' instruction concerning baptism. Matthew's record reads, go therefore make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Mark's report in Mark 16:16 reads, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. Matthew's report coming from Matthew 28:19. Now, John doesn't record the Great Commission like Matthew and Mark do, both of which involve the instruction to baptize. But John does add depth to our understanding of what baptism is, the rebirth by water and spirit in John 3:3-5. Where the others simply give the command that the apostles baptize, John gives the theology behind what they are to do. Now, the reason why I go through all that is for this reason. As John did for the sacrament of baptism, he adds theological depth to our understanding of the sacrament of the Eucharist. He's revealing to us that the Eucharist at the Last Supper is the new bread from heaven, and thus the new manna. He's teaching us that the Eucharist not only forgives our sins, but gives us eternal life. He's providing us confirmation that Jesus did intend for us to take his words at the Last Supper literally. Hence his record of Jesus' use of flesh, which underscores the literalness of the language Jesus used. Therefore, John intends to inform his readers that just as Jesus' instruction to eat his flesh and drink his blood in John 6 was literal, so too are his words at the Last Supper. And given the supernatural nature of the Eucharist, there is no need to give up the literal interpretation of Jesus' use of the verb is in favor of a figurative interpretation, as we see in 1 Corinthians 10:4. The two cases are disanalogous, and so you can't read one in light of the other, but you can read the Last Supper in light of John 6. Stay tuned, more to come on the other side. Well, welcome back to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason, where we're looking at some Protestant comebacks to the literal interpretation of Jesus' words at the Last Supper, "This is my body, this is my blood." And so far in today's episode, we've been looking only at one Protestant comeback or response from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, and giving our responses. And before our last break, I was just wrapping up our general answer in response to that comeback in light of the supernatural nature of the Eucharist. Given the supernatural nature of the Eucharist, there's no need to give up the literal interpretation of Jesus' use of the verb is in favor of the figurative interpretation, as we see in 1 Corinthians 10:4. The two cases are disanalogous and thus can't be read in light of each other. Believers in the real presence, therefore, don't have to settle for the claim that Jesus became a rock in the wilderness in order to keep our literal interpretation of the words of institution, "This is my body, this is my blood." And furthermore, as we spent quite a bit of time in the last segment, we can read the words of the Last Supper in light of John 6 and use John 6 as an interpretive context for the words at the Last Supper. And that interpretive context provides for us the supernatural miraculous context, which allows for us to interpret "this is my body, this is my blood" with a literal understanding. Because if it were merely a symbol, there would be no need for such a miraculous or supernatural context. Okay, let's now move to our last Protestant comeback that we're going to consider in today's episode to the literal reading of the words of institution at the Last Supper. The comebacks that we've considered so far in the previous episode where we've done this, talked about this issue, and the comeback that we've considered so far in today's episode, have appealed to evidence from which a Protestant infers that Jesus was not speaking literally when he said, "This is my body, this is my blood." Protestant author Todd Baker, however, makes an argument that Jesus in John 16:25 explicitly tells his disciples that his words are to be understood figuratively. Okay? Indeed, right after the Last Supper was celebrated, Jesus told the disciples that his teachings and the words he spoke to them up to that point in time were given in figurative language. He says in John 16:25, "These things I have spoken to you in figurative language." In his book, Exodus from Rome, Volume 1, Baker argues that since Jesus says this after the Passover meal, which included the words of institution, we must conclude that, quote, he says, "the words Jesus spoke about bread and wine being his body and blood were figurative expressions for the new covenant and of the Messiah's imminent death on the cross for the salvation of man." So notice here, the argument is that, hey, well, wait a minute, Jesus actually explicitly tells us that the words he's using are figurative in nature, and he's intending them to be such. That's the argument, because he says in John 16:25, which is in the context of the Last Supper, "the words I've spoken to you are figurative." So that would seem to be a slam dunk for the figurative interpretation view of the words of the Last Supper against the literal reading. So how do we respond? Well, the fundamental problem with this argument is that it takes a verse in John 16:25 and applies it to the words of institution. But remember, John's account of the Last Supper does not include the words of institution. This is exegetically implausible and violates the standard rules of hermeneutics. Even numerous Protestant scholars don't endorse this proposal in their commentaries on John. Instead, they identify, quote unquote, these things that Jesus is referring to, that he's spoken figuratively about, as the things John has just reported Jesus speaking about, not with Matthew and Mark are reporting on with, the words of institution. Check out Merrill C. Tenney, The Gospel of John, in the book The Expositor's Bible Commentary, Volume 9, John and Acts, and also Leon Morris, The Gospel According to John, which is part of the New International Commentary on the New Testament. There you have some scholarly sources that affirm that these things that Jesus was speaking figuratively about is referring to something John reported on and not what Matthew and Mark are reporting on, namely the words of institution. So that's an assumption that Baker is making in his objection, which Protestant scholars will dismiss. Furthermore, if we were to entertain this proposal, how would we know which statements from the other evangelists' accounts of the Last Supper should be taken figuratively? Unless we were to say that everything the other evangelists reported Jesus saying at the Last Supper was figurative, which is certainly untrue, we would have no basis for applying a figurative interpretation to their accounts of the words of institution unless John quoted those, which he doesn't. Since John doesn't quote the words of institution, Baker's comeback is an arbitrary and exegetically fallacious move to try to apply John 16:25 to words that John does not even quote, rather than understanding it in the obvious sense of applying to words John has quoted Jesus saying. Now, this comeback suffers from yet another problem. This assumption that just because Jesus used figurative language for one thing at the Last Supper, he must have intended to use figurative language for everything he said at the Last Supper. It's true that Jesus said some things that included metaphors. So, for example, in John 15:5, he said, "I am the vine." In John 16:21 through 22, Jesus says when a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when she is delivered of the child, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that the child is born into the world. So you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice. But surely not everything Jesus said at the Last Supper was meant to be taken figuratively. Presumably, a Protestant wouldn't want to say Jesus' comment about his disciples being persecuted as he was persecuted was figurative. Here's what Jesus says in John 15:20. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Nor would a Protestant think Jesus speaks figuratively when he says there in chapter 16, verse 2, they will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. Since Jesus spoke both figuratively, as indicated in the previous examples I gave, and literally, in light of the previous examples I gave, more work would need to be done to discern whether Jesus' words about eating his flesh and drinking his blood fall into the figurative category that he spoke of in chapter 16, verse 25. So Baker's assertion that Jesus was speaking figuratively about the words of institution in 16:25 is just unfounded. There's not enough evidence in that text itself. Maybe it could be, but we would need to do further work whether to know if the words of institution fall within that figurative category, because he's speaking literally and figuratively within the context of the Last Supper. Now, finally, this comeback is problematic because it fails to consider the immediate context in which we find two plausible reference for Jesus' words. Consider that just 4 verses earlier in John 16, Jesus uses the metaphor of a woman in labor, which I already just quoted. With this immediate reference, there is no need to suggest that Jesus was referring to the words of institution that he said earlier in the evening. That's a plausible reference to what he's speaking of. Another possible reference, which even Protestant scholars like Craig Keener recognize, is Jesus' various statements about the Father. Notice that Jesus contrasts the things of which he spoke in figures with speaking plainly of the Father. That's what he says explicitly. This suggests that what he spoke in figures has to do with what he said about God the Father. Within the immediate context, there are several things he says of the Father that are a bit cryptic. In 15:23, he who hates me hates my Father also. 15:26, the Spirit of truth who proceeds from the Father. 16:5, now I am going to him who sent me. 16:10, because I go to the Father and you will see me no more. He also says in verse 15, all that the Father has is mine. Therefore I said that he will take what is mine and declare it to you. Those are a lot of cryptic sayings about God the Father. John even explicitly records that the apostles didn't understand what Jesus meant when he spoke of going to the Father. John reports on this in chapter 16, verse 18. So a believer in the real presence doesn't have to conclude that Jesus was speaking figuratively when he said, this is my body, this is my blood. So in 16:25, when John reports that Jesus says, I'm no longer going to talk figuratively, we're not required to think that he's speaking of the words of the Last Supper. There are more plausible explanations as to what he's referring to by figurative things. Probably and most likely the cryptic sayings that he said about the Father. Well, my friends, that's all the time that we have for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. My claim today that the two Protestant comebacks to a literal interpretation of the words of institution fell. A literal interpretation of the words of institution does not demand that we interpret Paul literally when he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, that Christ was the rock that followed the Israelites in the wilderness. Those are disanalogous events. There is no supernatural context in 1 Corinthians 10:4 that would lend itself to interpret those words literally. Given that there's no supernatural miraculous context, we can interpret the use of the verb to be to mean the rock represented Christ. But at the Last Supper, there is a miraculous context, which lends us to interpret the verb to be to mean that Jesus changed bread and wine into his body and his blood. Secondly, Jesus was not talking about his words of institution when he said at the Last Supper that he would no longer speak figuratively. So these two Protestant comebacks fail, which means the believer in the real presence can continue to appeal to the words of institution, this is my body, this is my blood, at the Last Supper as evidence for the belief in Christ's real presence. My friends, I invite you to join me again next week. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless.